Welcome to Future Foodcast. I'm Pamela Miller, your host, and I want to thank our sponsor, Farm to Plate. They are creating products and applications within the food industry supply chain. You can find out more at farmtoplate.io. Today, they're bringing to us a seasoned professional and a researcher. This is Chris Bryant. He is CEO and founder of Bryant Research. Welcome to the podcast, Chris.
Thanks so much for having me on.
Yeah, I'm excited to have a researcher in the food industry on our show. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your research company and how you even got started?
Yes, absolutely. Well, yes, as you said in the introduction, I'm the director of Bryant Research, which is a social research organization. We do social science that includes polling, focus groups, social experiments, and things like that. As well as policy papers, economic papers, and sort of position papers on issues related to this. Everything we do is to do with the protein transition. So it's about reducing meat and other animal products and promoting alternative proteins, being plant-based and cultivated meat and so on, which I'm sure your listeners will be familiar with already. But we're focused on transitioning away from animal products and towards alternatives, and specifically on the sort of social dimensions of that. So consumer perceptions, policy, economic impacts, that kind of thing.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. We have had some people on talking about the protein transition and alternatives from the company perspective. And for our listeners, we do have more to come, actually, that we have in the pipeline. But interesting that you actually do the research on those social impacts and other parameters around that transition. So let's dive into what's happening these days. What's top of mind for you that you've been writing a lot about?
Yeah, well, there are a bunch of components to this, and I've been thinking a bit lately about kind of how they fit together overall. It's part of the world that I come from, I suppose, if you could put it that way, is in effective animal advocacy, where a very popular approach is this sort of institutional advocacy. So the idea is that if you can get a big restaurant or if you can get a big government to agree to some sort of animal welfare policy in their country or in their supply chain, that's going to impact many, many more animals than if you persuade an individual to go vegetarian or vegan, for example. And so there are all sorts of things that you can do on that institutional level to try and move things in a direction that is going to have better outcomes for animals, which is, ultimately what we're concerned with. But I think part of that is sometimes missed is that institutions, for the most part, are sort of downstream of individuals. So governments can't do things which voters will reject, and likewise, companies can't do things which consumers will reject. So if you're, the CEO of Walmart, you can't just decide to stop selling factory farmed products tomorrow if all of the consumers still want cheap animal products, because they'll just go to Target instead, right? I'm trying to think of American supermarkets. So likewise with politicians, right? Biden can't come out and say we're going to ban factory farming if all of the voters want cheap animal products still, because they're just going to vote for Trump, right? So there's a lot to be done at that sort of institutional level, but it's usually within a window of kind of what the public will accept, and the public, individuals, consumers, voters are kind of the ultimate stakeholder to persuade if you're looking to make change on a large scale. Although those institutions can be, a nice kind of mediating and moderating force to focus on in the interim as well.
Well, that brings up, I know, one of your focuses, which is kind of that psychological part of alternative meat products and the consumers, like how people are thinking about that, receiving that. I know that's been a focus of yours and your research. And what are you finding there that can help with the transition that you're trying to achieve?
Yeah, it's such an interesting role for alternative proteins to play, because so much of our usual thinking about meat and animal products is through the lens of basically motivated reasoning, where people will arrive at a lot of their ideas about meat and animal products as a result of whether they eat animal products rather than the other way around, right? You would kind of hope that we would make an assessment of the facts and then decide what to do, sort of our actions following on from our beliefs. But oftentimes it's kind of the other way around, right? We're all born, for the most part, meat eater by default. Certainly I was, and most people in our, Western society, right, will be brought up that way. And so deviating from that requires some sort of effort and some sort of, decision to do something differently. And in the meantime, it's very predictable from a psychological perspective that people will form beliefs that justify the behavior, even if they're kind of doing that behavior by default. They haven't actually decided, okay, I'm gonna eat meat now, but they will look, okay, I'm a meat eater, and then they'll infer from that, therefore I must believe X, Y, Z. So there's kind of this motivated reasoning thing going on. Part of that is saying, well, I'm a meat eater, but a big part of it is also saying, I don't want to stop eating meat, right? If I agree to whatever statements it might be about animals have ability to feel pain or whatever, there's going to be an argument for me to stop eating meat. And there's an experiment where people are asked those kind of questions. They're asked about the moral status of a cow. And before they answer, half of them are given beef jerky to eat and half of them are given nuts. And the people who are given the beef jerky give lower evaluations then subsequently of cows' moral worth, right? So their beliefs are literally changed by eating meat. And so I think that's where alternative proteins come in and say, if you could have the perfect meat alternative, something which tastes and is nutritionally identical and doesn't cost any more and so on, would there really be any motivation for anyone to claim to be like unsure as to whether cows can have a subjective experience, right? It seems like no one would really be motivated to claim to have that belief if you just had the perfect meat alternative instead. So I think that motivated reasoning and that kind of cognitive dissonance, which is very, very common for, vegetarian advocates, will have experienced this. They're speaking to people kind of coming up with their reasons. When you have alternative proteins, it actually takes out the motivation for that motivated reasoning. Like, why would I ever want to claim to have some elaborate belief about cows' brains if plant-based burgers are just as nice, right? So I think that's kind of the role from a motivated reasoning perspective. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, what are some of the benefits that you present to plant-based eating or meat alternatives? It might not be plant-based. It might be something else, I imagine.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I think so. A big one that people are increasingly familiar with is the environmental case against meat and animal consumption. Now, the PR machine on the other side has whirred into action in recent years. And so we are now, many of us, seeing terms like regenerative. And there's some sort of suggestion that maybe if cows are farmed in the right way, then we don't need to reduce our meat consumption at all. It's a complete red herring, really. It is true that there are some systems which are less environmentally damaging than others, but the killer question for somebody advocating for those kind of systems is how much of our meat could actually be produced this way? And the answer is like less than 10%, right? It's a really, really small, right? Most of the meat we're having is coming from industrial farms. It's not actually scalable to be able to have our current level of meat consumption with only using regenerative meat. Really, whichever way you cut it, like meat alternatives are orders of magnitude better for the environment, right? It's like 99% less emissions, water use, and everything else.
Okay.
So there's the environmental side. That's a big part, and that's quite like broad appeal as well, which is good. The health side is an interesting one because a lot of people, and again, this is the result of lobbying on the other side, now have on their hard drive this idea that plant-based meat equals ultra-processed equals unhealthy. That connection has been very strongly and deliberately made in all of our minds by at least half a decade of meat industry lobbying. You can look back to 2019 and see the Center of Consumer Freedom, putting up the New York Times and the Super Bowl ads. They were attacking plant-based meat because it's processed, with the implication that it's unhealthy, right? So it's been going on for at least 5 years out in the open that the meat industry has been making that association. And the interesting thing about it is it's very clearly misleading. Here's the structure of it, right? You'll have statement 1, plant-based meats are ultra-processed foods. Okay, that's a correct statement. Statement 2, ultra-processed foods tend to be unhealthy. That's also a correct statement. Now, if you read those next to each other, you kind of come away with the feeling that you've read plant-based meats are unhealthy, but you haven't. And in fact, they're not. If you look at just the nutritional comparison rather than degree of processing, which doesn't really have anything to do with healthiness if you think about it. If you look at just the nutritional comparison compared to meat from animals, plant-based meat has a lower calorie density, has a lower saturated fat level, has no cholesterol, and has higher fiber. So in all of these ways, which are super relevant to our health, the plant-based alternatives are healthier than meat. But the animal industries have done a very good job of kind of suggesting that plant-based alternatives are unhealthy merely because they're processed. It's actually not the case at all.
Okay. Interesting. Well, you brought into that conversation another topic that I wanted to hear from you about, which has to do with how our animals are raised these days, because it's changed over time. I mean, we used to have, small family farms, and now that's less common. We're more industrialized. You referred to that in your last conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And in the US, it's over 99% of animals are reared on factory farms. And worldwide, it's over 90% of farmed animals are on factory farms, right? So this idea of kind of the small family farm and the high welfare animals, right? It's not that they don't exist, but they are a minuscule proportion of the meat and animal products that we have. And moreover, there's not really any way to reliably source them, because many of the labels that we might look to guide us to buy high welfare products either are completely meaningless. So, for example, in the UK, there's lots of products that say from trusted farms. Doesn't mean it's not a certification scheme. It's not guarantee of anything. It's just fluff, basically. So there are some which are completely meaningless, like trusted farms, and then there are some which on paper do have a standard, but because they're set up as private certification schemes, whereby the farms pay a subscription fee to the label, well, there's no incentive for the label to ever be rescinded, right? Because if I'm, RSPCA is the big one that's coming under fire in the UK at the moment. If I'm the RSPCA and you're a pig farm that's paying me, 10,000 a year to put the RSPCA logo on your products, why would I ever come to your farm and say you're doing this wrong? You need to, because I'm just going to lose 10,000 a year, right? So
I see.
There's the problem with the private certifications. That maybe they're better than nothing, but maybe not by much, right? What you really want is the government, a central system, to say there's going to be a consistent and clear and honest and well enforced animal welfare label system. Okay. At the moment, certainly in the UK, we just have kind of a patchwork of private schemes, and people don't know the difference between RSPCA and Red Tractor. And again, a lot of that is by design, right? The more confusing it is, the easier it is to get away with selling factory farmed products as if they're high welfare, which, by the way, is exactly what Red Tractor is. If you look at the Red Tractor label in the UK, it's people think it's some sort of a guarantee of animal welfare. Really, the standards are like pretty much the same as the legal minimum in the UK.
Okay. Well, yeah, and to the normal consumer, and we do have a worldwide audience, Chris. So UK is we have a lot of listeners with you over in the UK, so that's not a problem at all. But the not to totally throw anybody under the bus, I'm sure they have justifications for what they're doing with individual certifications. But your point is, if we have a unmotivated third party, like they're not otherwise, it's not a closed circle where they're certifying and they're getting paid to certify, and and why would you ever change that? I get your point with that. To have a more independent certification process would just carry a lot more credibility to the consumer to know that was a real certification was happening, instead of just maybe a label that looks good, and we're more in the marketing category than in delivering a credible certified product category. I think that's what I'm hearing you saying.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, there's no need for no, yeah, you pretty much nailed it. I don't nothing to add.
Okay. Well, and we talk about too those big factory farms, because that's when you get into worse, I think, typically animal welfare issues. They're not going to be treated like they were in quote unquote now the very smallest percentage worldwide. of animals that are raised, they're not in that environment. They're in a more industrialized environment. And so that's when it's harder to meet any kind of animal welfare targets that might be set up. So the family farm definition, I know that's also something else that you've written about, looking at your articles and things. You can kind of make that definition sound good, right? I mean, you share about that a little bit.
Right. Yes. Yes. That's thank you for prompting me on that point. We had points. So, well, for a little bit of context, in
Yeah.
Europe there had been farmer protests, and farmers indeed do have all sorts of problems, and their life is getting harder, and farming is worse than it used to be, frankly. There are fewer farming jobs, and farming jobs are not particularly well paid either. These farming protests have been really, I would say, appropriated by the big agri companies, which are the ones that have caused these problems. So where you used to have many, many small farmers tending their land and doing their thing on a small scale, which, as you mentioned, is typically going to be much better for animals and for other outcomes. Increasingly, that is consolidated into a smaller number of, basically giant meat producing companies, and those are able to undercut the smaller producers, and so the market kind of tends towards these increasingly consolidated and kind of brutally low cost systems. And there's all sorts of obfuscation that goes on around this. So in the States, there's a definition of family farm, which you hear and you imagine that means small scale, high welfare, the type of farm that we would want to see. In fact, a family farm just means anything where it's at least 50% owned by a single family, and that can just mean one person, right? So if it's just like mostly owned by one guy, that counts as a family farm. It doesn't actually say anything about the number of animals or the condition that those animals are kept in. So again, it's very tricky. A lot of the language that is used here is kind of suggesting that there's something high welfare going on without ever claiming it, because the claim couldn't be backed up, right? Okay, you give that a second thought. Okay, well, yeah, maybe that is a fair definition of a family farm, right? One family. Okay. Now, there's an assumption that means high welfare or something else about the ownership structure, but yeah, it's there's a lot of sleight of hands going on.
Exactly. And I think the average person, when they hear family farm, has a vision of what that is. And that's the point that you're making. We're not going by a legalistic definition of what the ownership structure looks like. We're thinking about what the farm looks like, fences, animals grazing out in pastures, whatever that might be, chickens running around the yard, whatever your vision of a family farm is. And that doesn't have to be the case at all. And in most cases is not the case, is your point. So
for sure. And I just to close the loop on what I was saying about the farmer protests, they big agricultural companies who are doing the consolidating of these farms and reducing the number of farming jobs and pushing down those farming wages have caused the problems and have done a phenomenal job of blaming alternative proteins. So in a lot of countries in Europe now, in Italy, they have banned cultivated meat. Right now, how many of Italian farmers' problems have been caused by cultivated meat? 0 would be the answer that you're looking for there, right? It doesn't exist yet. It hasn't been sold yet in Europe. But they've done a very good job, the lobbyists, of saying, yes, farmers are hard done by. Let's make this about alternative proteins. They have caused the problem, and they have done not to give them too much credit, but they really have done a very good political job of saying, pointing to their competition essentially, and having further policy passed to increase their own grip on the market.
That's an interesting point that you bring out. So cultivated meat has not yet been sold in Italy, yet it's already been banned in Italy. Okay. Thanks for stating the facts. Yeah. I'm sure a lot of that is happening that I had no idea. And you're right. Great lobbying and marketing and just setting the narrative, I guess, is what I'm hearing you say. And that's a lot of why your research company is writing articles, doing research, and getting some of the facts of certain cases so you can hopefully get those out to the public. Well, I know there's another article out there that was of interest to me, and it was called The Way to a Meat Eater's Heart. And that's a big article that you wrote. And I don't know if we chatted about it a little bit. I don't know if you have any points from that you would like to bring out to our audience, because I would imagine that I bet you know the numbers of how many people are plant-based eaters or vegan or vegetarian, all the categories. I think I can put just a lot of names over there that to some of us who aren't involved in that, it gets convoluted as to what the rules are for each one. So I'm going to put plant-based eaters in one category and meat eaters in another category. But what would you like to say as a plant-based eating advocate to the meat eaters?
Yeah, for sure. I think it's really important that we are looking at those sectors because, like you say, the our sort of common allies, I guess, feel like the vegetarians and the vegans and the pescatarians. In the UK, all of those groups together are, I think, now up to about 15%, which is not nothing. That's pretty good going. And there's some evidence that 25% often represents some kind of tipping point where people start to say, okay, this is something to take seriously now. But that said, 85% are still meat eaters, right? So it is, of course, crucially important. And moreover, those are the only people who we are trying to persuade, right? We do many studies where we're doing one at the moment where we're trying to recruit specifically men to take part in a focus group. And with a view to doing a bit of a pilot study, we are kind of just speaking to people that we know and say, can you have any, male friends who will volunteer for a pilot? And our issue there is that everyone who works in my company know that all of the people they know are vegetarians. We're like, we're trying to research meat eaters, right? So, yeah, I think it's incredibly important that we are learning how to communicate with meat eaters. And this particular study that you mentioned, the outcome, as I mentioned, it was the thing that I mentioned about motivated reasoning, and people saw a picture of either appealing or unappealing chicken or plant-based food. And the idea being that when people saw the appealing plant-based food compared to the unappealing plant-based food, they're much more likely to have a preference for plant-based eating afterwards. And so really it's about the quality of the alternatives on offer. So, one of the takeaways from this is that better quality alternatives, more preference for plant-based, right? So that's where the alternative proteins are coming in. Again, we spoke about reducing that need for the motivated reasoning. So that's one thing. And then I think actually almost maybe just as important is with the implications for relatively unappealing vegan products. Because in the last, I would say, couple of years where there's been some more challenges for our sector, there have been some companies which have gone under in that time, but sales across the sector have slowed down a little bit, and some of the companies have not been able to sustain. Whilst obviously that's bad news for those companies in particular, it might be that it's good news for the sector overall, because really what we don't want to happen is for people who are on the fence about trying plant-based, we are trying to persuade them for a long time, for them to try a product which is not very good. And, frankly, there are products that exist that are not very good, and then to be put off the category overall. So when we see like particular brands or particular products going under or being discontinued or being taken off the market, oftentimes, people on our side, vegetarians and vegans, are assuming that this is bad news. And sometimes it is bad news, particularly if you like the product, right? But maybe not always. It could be a good thing for the worst products to be taken off the market, because that means that the average quality of plant-based product is going to increase, so that when people come to actually try it, they're more likely to have a good experience. They're more likely to purchase again.
Well, Chris, I will say, that's probably just normal market trajectory, right? When you have a fairly new category. Let's be honest, it's not 100 years old. People have been eating out of their gardens forever, but as far as
Sure.
some plant-based foods that you would buy in the grocery store that are already packaged and made, not talking about the produce department where you just buy and make your own plant-based foods, but I think we're mainly talking about those that are somehow processed in some manner. And I'll just tell you, 25 years ago, I tried a plant-based burger, and it was not good. But that was ago. I think there was only one brand on the market. It was
Right.
before anybody was really talking about it a lot. But that has stuck with me. I can tell you that I haven't really tried another plant-based burger. I do try different plant-based foods. I make a lot of vegetables on my own, though. I love to cook, so I'm in that category. I'm not as inclined to buy the processed food, but I think it's a normal shaking out of the market. And the companies that survive are going to have the quality product and that people like, and they're going to keep iterating and improving on that. And then, you'll get some momentum in that category. And so I agree with you. I don't think it's all a bad thing. Maybe it's just the normal market settling out as companies go. But I think COVID probably had a lot to do with that as well. I mean, there's probably some good companies out there that just were not able to make it through our worldwide pandemic a few years ago.
Yeah, well, it's like creative destruction, isn't it? Like you say, particularly when things are a relatively new category, you expect to see like a relatively high amount of churn in the plant-based section in UK supermarkets. I mean, I feel like it's settled down a little bit now, but there was a period of 2 or 3 years where you would go to the same section in the supermarket and see different brands every week, right? They're always trying new things and bringing things through, discontinuing things, bringing other things, which is good news. They were sticking with, or at least making a note of, the products which did well.
Right.
And so, yeah, absolutely, the category is going to get much better overall. And Pam, I challenge you to try another plant-based burger, because they've gotten a lot better in 20 years, I promise you.
After this interview, I will have to do that. Chris, I promise you that I will
Good.
email you back. I promise I will. But I think there'll be some consolidation in the category as well. And that's good. Some companies combining, some of the smaller companies will get some traction and then combine, and they'll figure it out. And we can watch all that happen. I know you will be writing about it. Is there
Absolutely.
anything else that you would like to leave with our audience before we go, Chris?
Yeah, I think there's all sorts of things that we can all engage in to try to push the food system and the world more broadly in a direction that we want it to go. And understanding that individuals and our attitudes and beliefs and behaviors are the ultimate driver of what happens in companies and what happens in governments. And just engaging on a personal level with being critical of one's own beliefs, I think, is always something that is valuable, and encouraging others to do the same, and sharing useful information which supports the truth, and elucidating and elaborating where there is some misleading information or misinformation. It does matter, what the average person on Twitter thinks, unfortunately. So keep having those conversations and keep making sense.
Yes, I think being curious is a good thing to be, and just investigating and thinking for yourself. And I know Bryant Research and your website is a great place for people to go if they want to read about the latest information and some of the research that you're doing on the current trends and what's happening in the world. So thank you so much for being on our show, Chris.
Thanks so much for having me, Pam.
Yeah, if you enjoyed this interview with Chris and want to hear more, please engage with us, leave a comment, subscribe, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks for listening to Future Foodcast. Future Foodcast is powered by Farm to Plate, the leading food blockchain platform. Subscribe on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts to stay up to date with the very latest innovations in the food industry.